Thank you very much for asking me to speak today. I'm a paediatric oncologist in Cardiff, and I was asking Mark why he'd asked me. I'm involved in the international clinical trial for rhabdomyosarcoma, which I guess gives me some basis for this, but I am also grateful to a number of colleagues who have contributed slides so that I can try and give you a broader picture of what I think it means to develop international clinical trials. So I just want to briefly go over why we need them, how we develop them, and what have been, over the last decade, some of the challenges in drawing different countries together to try and improve outcomes for children with cancer. And then a brief word on perhaps where we're going in the future. So why do we need them? It's pretty obvious, and you've obviously had reference to it this morning, that relatively speaking, there are low numbers of children with cancer. I know it feels big at the time, but when we talk about breast, bowel, I mean, what summed it up to me was I was on the CR UK website looking at the whole numbers thing, and it just said express the numbers per million rather than numbers per 100,000, because it's such a lower scale that in terms of numbers that children have. We need to continue to improve survival rates, so we need to get together to work on that. We know that there's a background to this, that clinical trials improve outcome. There's also the issue of access to drugs, which I will touch on, and the issue of getting funding now for these clinical trials, and therefore they need to be robust, and to be robust they have to have adequate numbers. So there's one of many ways one can express how rare children's cancers are. Somewhere between 150 to 200 per million population. The numbers go down as in the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 age group and start to rise again as the children enter their teenage years. But overall, very low. And this equates, as you, I'm sure, well know, to about 1,500 children diagnosed each year in the UK. Then you break it down even further. So if you're going to do a clinical trial, you want to do it on a specific diagnostic group, the largest of which is leukemia. But if you then break it down by the other diagnostic groups, and there are then others still, this makes the challenge even greater to try and bring together sufficient numbers to answer questions. Oh, there was a title on that slide, but clearly it's gone. And so if we think of the 60-odd million people that are in the UK, we need to combine with at least Europe for some of these diagnoses to have an adequate number of patients to bring together for these studies. So the incidence is low. One of the other challenges is that the survival it's great, survival is very good, but if you're looking at clinical trials and comparing outcome, you want to compare what we call events. And if the events are getting fewer and fewer, the number of patients you have to have in that clinical trial becomes larger and larger, because unless you're having the events, you won't see a difference of whether a new treatment is having any benefit. And therefore, the numbers looking in the sort of survival rates we're looking at are really very high if you look at absolute terms. Now, there are very clever statistical manoeuvres going on, and there are other ways, but this is not a statistical lecture. This is that's it for the stats. And so although we can just about, over a 5 to 6 year period, recruit enough children with leukemia, and as I've shown you, that's the biggest group, diagnostic group, other diagnoses, if we were just to stick to the UK, would need an awful lot longer. So I just want to reflect back a little bit on where we've got to and why the trials are important. There's clear evidence of improved survival, and I have only got 20 minutes, so you're going to have to take my word for some of these statements rather than me keep showing you the evidence for them. The clinical trials in another way also define the standard of care, so that when you've got a clinical trial running, you have a standard, and then you have an experimental arm that you're exploring, and that in turn improves the equity and the delivery of the treatment for different patient groups across the piece. So whilst not everybody has to be on a clinical trial, it is a way in which the treatment is made more equitable. The basis on which we've done clinical trials in paediatric oncology, latterly and ongoing, has largely been academic. Increasingly, there are pharma-sponsored studies and new drugs, and I will mention new drugs a little later on. But this has been one of the challenges because of the academic infrastructure that's underpinned the studies. Funding has always been and remains an issue, and I will come back to that too. And in the past, we relied on professional commitment. The CCLG has been a core part of developing national and international trials. But over the last decade, that's now become an issue for the law. And that's really what's changed in the last decade. The European Clinical Trial Directive was introduced and applicable from May 2004. And if you didn't comply to it, that was a legal issue. And therefore, rightly, a number of important changes came into play. But with them came a number of challenges also. The intentions of the European Directive were all very, very good and remain good. It's not that I want to say it's a bad thing. It's just resulted in a lot of challenges for us in paediatric oncology. The aim was to protect patients rather than just allow trials to generate and have good ideas. Then there was a much, much more robust infrastructure around protecting the patients. Accountability, clear accountability for the people undertaking the trials was introduced. And this concept of sponsoring was also introduced. This is the sponsor, whether it's national or international, is responsible for the insurance, for the safety, and for the conduct of the trial. And that's clearly a very big issue if you're taking on patients from across more than across your own country, let alone your own centre. And so there was a regulation that introduced the standards, established mechanisms for what we call pharmacovigilance, which is the regulation of the drugs in the clinical trials. The role of ethical committees was defined, a register of trials was defined, and an important part of this was control of the manufacture and labelling of what's known as IMPs, investigational medicinal products. And that with it has brought, and again, because of time, I can't go into the detail of that, but suffice it to say that the structure around that means that, that there are strict guidelines about anything that's used within, about defining the drug as an investigational medicinal product and how it's labelled wherever it's given. And I know you're talking about shared care, and I'm sure that's an issue that will come up later. Safety reporting has also been it's always been a critically important thing. The whole idea of SAEs is very long-standing, serious adverse events which need to report it if they're occurring in the study. Serious adverse reactions to an investigational product or unexpected serious adverse reactions, suspected unexpected serious adverse reactions, are clearly important to report. If you're doing that in the context of an international clinical study, the system whereby it's reported, the information gathered, and then sent back out to all the different participating centres is clearly a huge logistic challenge. So there was a problem really after the introduction of the GCP. It was really set up for pharma studies, and the infrastructure for academic studies wasn't robust enough to begin with, and I think there's been a very steep learning curve in implementing it. It was soon after, a year or two after it was Mike Stevens has kindly given me these slides of a survey that was done a year or two after the introduction of GCP, and it clearly showed increasing cost, bureaucracy, time to activate trials, and the technical expertise involved in doing that. And this led inevitably to a decreased number of trials and a decrease in enthusiasm of the investigator, and almost a reversal on what the initiative was meant to do in terms of improving patient care. Other issues was a reluctance of institutions, as you can probably understand, to undertake sponsorship, and really make it very difficult to get all the data required. So this was then a threat to small trials, a threat to academic investigators' trials, and in most cases, no practical benefit was perceived. And this isn't an understatement, an overstatement when it shows you some of the paperwork required for some of these international studies. And the role of the clinical trial coordinator was perhaps not a happy one at times. However, we're resilient, and all was not lost. And many people have got together and regrouped to try and move forward. And there are successful international clinical trials completed and ongoing. The paediatric international groups have continued, despite all this, to collaborate, both by country, and these are just a snapshot of the German, Italian, Norwegian, Nordic countries, Australia, New Zealand. They all coordinate by diagnosis. There are a number of groups who are still very, very active. And the survival rates have also continued to improve despite all of this. And so I'm grateful to Jeremy Whelan and Matthew Sides for giving me these few slides, because Euramos is probably the biggest and the best example of the challenges of an international clinical trial. It has to be said, though, they had significant funding, and going forward, getting that kind of funding will remain a major challenge. This is their title slide. I think it says it all, really, in terms of the number of units participating, sponsors, funders, different countries. It was a complicated business. I'm not going to talk in any detail about the study, except that it makes sense to give you a little bit of a feel for it. So patients had, it wasn't a simple study. Patients had induction chemotherapy, surgery, depending on the response of the tumour to surgery, either a good or poor response. There was a randomisation then to the standard treatment, which was MAP, plus or minus interferon for the low-risk group, or plus or minus ifosfamide and etoposide for the high-risk patients, making those the investigational medicinal products. There were several groups involved, from the US and Canada, the sort of German-based group, European group, which include this is sort of EORTC base, and the Scandinavian group, and a coordinating centre in the UK. And really, then it got on. I love this. This is his slide. I'm not so good with the graphics, but there was then an account which had to support all these different countries that fed into these different groups. And then there was a need to coordinate all the data. There was a quality of life group, the main coordinating centre in the UK, and then a safety desk in Germany. All of these needed to interact. And then there was other funding from pharma, which supported many of the countries involved, with the two trial management committees running within America and the UK. So, a lot was achieved, but you can see by that slide how complicated it was. And that continued with, this is just demonstrating the interface between the funders, the sponsors, and the safety desk. Again, important frameworks. But they recruited well, they recruited successfully. The point of this slide is you need those different international groups to get the numbers up, to get an answer to the question. The analysis has not been done, so I can't give you the answer. You have to watch this space. But the fact is the patients were recruited despite all the challenges. And then these are his slides. These are not my slides. And I'd actually written that part of the talk, but this is what was on his slide. He felt that there was great successes, timely and important question, pan-European funding, and there was experience coordinating trials units working together in an effective core team. What were the downsides? The regulatory obstacles, expense, the bureaucracy, because of patient safety, and it is important, but the layers of bureaucracy are huge. A lack of reward for the local investigators, of whom there are many, and the fact that pharma really isn't interested in some of these phase 3 studies. I'm aware of time though. So what happens now? Well, Bruce Morland came to speak to us in a couple of weeks ago, and he showed us this, which is the basis for the next liver study. And I thought I'd just got to have that for my talk. And it starts with ideas, getting together in international Los Angeles Hilton, but actually is also based on a lot of evidence. And I'm not so good at I'd love to be able to do all those lines, but you'll have to look at it all together. You need all these people coming together with the evidence of their background, of their relative specialties, whether they're pathologists, oncologists, surgeons, clinical oncologists, radiologists, and others who will give an important background to the questions that are required. And increasingly, we need to involve translational questions about the biology of the tumour and understanding why some patients do well and some patients do less well. So these questions all have to be thrashed out and an outline proposal agreed. This then is shared with the international groups, and this little thing can take a long time, bouncing back and forth between the different cultural and other historical issues within different countries. Nonetheless, there's generally a goodwill. The trial will be modified and the protocol written. In the meantime, an international sponsor has to be identified, and funding for all participating countries has to be identified. So this, as you can imagine, can take an awfully long time. Once it's all agreed, the protocol's written and the funding's in place, approval by what we call the competent authorities, which for us would be the ethical committees, the R&D and MHRA need to approve the trial, and then it may be open. And delivering the trial not only requires an international sponsor, but in each country, data centre, access to the data centre, national coordinators, and the participating clinical centres have to have access to the remote data entry system and funding, which usually, not always, is via CTAC in the UK. And this is just an example of our EPSSG study, the rhabdomyosarcoma. So we have currently 156 centres participating in 13 countries. There are what we call the bigger players, which is France, Italy, Spain and the UK, have the biggest number of patients, but without the other countries, we still wouldn't get sufficient numbers to recruit and answer the questions we want to ask. And again, I could give you a lot of an example of how we've struggled because of initial collaboration with some of our European colleagues who then decided not to participate. We've then struggled to recruit the numbers we require to answer the question that we have in the rhabdomyosarcoma study, but that's ongoing. What about new drugs? I promised I wouldn't go over. This is another important point in terms of European initiatives and paediatric trials. There have been historical concerns about paediatric medicines in general, a lack of interest in new drug development, and for a long time I would give talks, I'm getting quite old now, in paediatric oncology, and actually the number of new drugs you could name on one hand in the whole time I'd been in a career. That's changing. That's changing for a number of reasons, but it has been a long time coming. There's also a problem with suitable formulations for children and with withdrawal of medicine for financial reasons, the whole so-called orphan drugs. So there was a need, and this was recognised through a European initiative, to do clinical trials in new agents in paediatrics, and another regulation was brought into place in 2006, which again was law, and this is taken straight from it. So the objective was to improve health of the children in Europe by increasing research and development in medicines. It's not just cancer, it's all medicines in children. Ensure children are having a high quality research in this, ensure information's available, and that make sure unnecessary clinical trials were not being done on children. And as a result of this, a few things happened. There was an establishment of a European Pediatric Committee for new drugs. And what we're most familiar with is the Pediatric Investigation Plan, which has to be put forward for any drugs that may be useful in children. And so Avastin is a good example of that, which I'm sure you've heard of in the adult world. There may be reasons why that would be valuable in children, and indeed a paediatric investigational plan was written, and the trial is now running in children with sarcomas to test whether or not there's a role for Avastin in that setting. But it's hard, and recruiting sufficient patients to get answers to these questions remains a challenge. And again, if I had more time, I could show you the outline of the Avastin study. But nonetheless, this process does facilitate and insist on clinical trials where the drug may be useful in children, and it will make more information on children, on the use of products in children available. Just to make the point that we are only one part of this, and there's a whole load of others. We represent that proportion, whatever that is, about 10%, 20% of the PIPs currently ongoing. So there are a number of benefits of international clinical trials: improving outcomes, equity of care, as I've mentioned, and allowing conclusions to be reached in a timely fashion. It also allows us to collect other data about registration data, which is a debate I won't go into at the moment, promoting, as I mentioned, translational research and improving the interface with basic science. There are ongoing challenges, including the political environment, the organisation of care across different countries, which might be very different, and culturally some of these things, we make assumptions about how things are done, about the size of units, about the way people interface, and that can be difficult on the ground. And research funding, as I keep coming back to, including clinical trial insurance, which continues to increase, is also a potential issue. So just looking forward, our challenges are going to be about dealing with those patients who are still in this difficult area, who are not doing well, the patients with higher risk disease, and also increasingly questions are being asked about the patients who are surviving cancer, looking at the impact of disease and its treatment, and an emphasis on quality of life in clinical trials. So in conclusion, and I'm on my 20 minutes because I started 3 minutes late, International trials are essential if we're going to be able to improve outcomes in rare diseases. The previous goodwill collaborations are now supported by a legal structure which has tightened up procedures but also increased bureaucracy and cost. Nonetheless, I do believe that successful collaborations are continuing. I think the emphasis in the future will be on diseases with poorer outcomes and the impact of disease and its treatment. And at the end of the day, you've got to address those cultural issues. Thank you very much.